What if I told you that some of the most powerful people in history were born not from love, but from incest? That entire empires were ruled by men and women whose parents were siblings, cousins, or even uncle and niece. This isn't the plot of a medieval horror story, it's real, and it's written in the bloodlines of kings, queens, and even American families hidden in the hills. For centuries, royalty and aristocrats believed in one terrifying idea: to protect their pure blood, they had to marry their own flesh and blood, and the consequences were devastating. We're talking about rulers who couldn't speak until age 4, who went insane by 20, or who were so physically deformed they were mistaken for monsters. But this isn't just a royal problem. One American family turned blue literally from generations of inbreeding. Another royal bride nearly married her own uncle, a man so disfigured he could barely chew food. In this video, we're counting down the 10 most inbred people in history, from Egyptian pharaohs to Spanish kings to Appalachian farmers, and you won't believe who takes the #1 spot. Their faces were twisted, their minds fractured, and their stories erased from public memory until now. This is the dark, disturbing legacy of inbreeding, and it's much closer to home than you think. She was born into a throne crowned not by merit, but by blood. But what flowed through Isabella II of Spain wasn't just royal lineage, it was the tangled thread of incest, secrecy, and scandal. From the moment she entered the world in 1830, Isabella carried the heavy weight of a family desperate to preserve its power at any cost. Her mother also her father's niece. That's right, Isabella was the product of an uncle-niece union, a genetic gamble disguised as royal strategy. And while she didn't exhibit the grotesque deformities seen in later generations of inbred monarchs, her body told its own quiet story: persistent weight issues, sluggish energy, and a life marked by instability. But the real scandal wasn't her health, it was her paternity. For years, whispers echoed through the marble halls of Madrid. Was Isabella truly the daughter of King Ferdinand VII, or the love child of her mother's alleged affair with a royal guard? Even in a court built on tradition and control, bloodlines could blur, and uncertainty could fester. This wasn't just a question of parentage, it was a threat to the entire Spanish succession. The monarchy needed her to be legitimate, Spain needed her to be real. And yet, no one could ever be sure. She became queen at just 3 years old and ruled during one of Spain's most turbulent eras, embroiled in political chaos, public distrust, and the quiet suspicion that her very existence might be a lie. Isabella wasn't just born of incest, she was born into a mystery, a royal pawn in a dangerous game of appearances. And whether she was her father's child or not, she became the face of a dynasty too entangled in its own blood to see where power ended and consequence began. In a world obsessed with purity, Isabella stood as the first crack in the royal mirror, still polished on the surface, but fractured underneath. In the remote hills of eastern Kentucky, far from palaces and royal courts, lived a family whose skin turned blue, literally blue. But this wasn't fantasy. It wasn't folklore. It was genetics gone awry. The Fugates weren't nobles or monarchs. They were ordinary American settlers who became an extraordinary case of what happens when isolation, ignorance, and inbreeding collide. It all began in the early 1800s when a French orphan named Martin Fugate settled in Troublesome Creek and married a red-haired woman named Elizabeth Smith. Neither of them knew they carried a rare recessive gene for a blood disorder called methemoglobinemia, a condition that reduces oxygen in the blood, turning skin a striking shade of blue. Out of their 7 children, 4 were born with blue skin, not pale, not bruised, blue as the sky. In a region cut off from the outside world with few roads and even fewer newcomers, the family had no choice but to marry within their own community, sometimes even within their own bloodline. Cousins wed cousins. The gene was passed again, and again, and again. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Blue Fugates had become legends, both feared and ridiculed by locals, shunned in public and whispered about in church pews. They weren't royalty, but they were unmistakably marked by their bloodline. Their legacy wasn't one of crowns or castles, it was of isolation and survival. In a land obsessed with normalcy, the Fugates became a walking reminder that difference can come not from evil, but from biology, and that inbreeding doesn't care whether you wear silk or flannel. Their story isn't a royal tragedy, it's an American one. A quiet, haunting chapter hidden in the hills where the pursuit of family and survival accidentally painted a lineage blue. She was born a countess, but history remembers her as a monster. Elizabeth Báthory, also known as the Blood Countess, wasn't just one of the most prolific female killers in history. She was the twisted bloom of a family tree tangled by centuries of inbreeding and aristocratic decay. Born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families of Hungary, Elizabeth's blood was as blue as it gets. Her parents were cousins, and nearly every branch of her family had folded inward for generations. This wasn't love. It was legacy preservation at all costs, and the cost was staggering. From a young age, Elizabeth was plagued by seizures, violent mood swings, and vivid hallucinations. Today, some historians speculate she may have suffered from a genetic form of epilepsy, an illness that at the time was treated with superstition. One treatment: drinking blood. That belief, combined with her warped psychology and unchecked power, may have sparked one of the darkest spirals in European history. Servants began to disappear. Girls were lured into the castle with promises of work. And the countess, it is said, bathed in their blood to preserve her youth, turning murder into ritual and vanity into violence. But Elizabeth wasn't operating alone. She was born into a world that rewarded cruelty if it came wrapped in silk. Her crimes were enabled by a network of servants' silence and social status. And at the core of it all was a bloodline so insular, so poisoned by its own pride, that it may have created not just a killer, but a legend. Elizabeth Báthory didn't just inherit her family's name, she inherited their madness. And whether the blood was meant as medicine or magic, it became the currency of a woman whose lineage carved a place for her in history, not as royalty, but as horror incarnate. He was born into the golden glow of Versailles, the heir to the most powerful monarch in Europe. Louis the Grand Dauphin of France, son of the Sun King. Louis XIV was destined to inherit an empire that dazzled the world. But behind the mirrors of the Hall of Versailles lay a far less radiant truth. Louis's family tree was more like a closed loop. His parents were double first cousins, meaning they shared all four grandparents. Genetically, that's a red flag the size of France. To the public eye, Louis seemed fine, healthy, educated, refined. He wasn't deformed or visibly disturbed like others on this list. But that's what made him dangerous. He was the illusion of strength masking a genetic house of cards. His birth represented the kind of high-stakes inbreeding that looked perfect from the outside but cracked under pressure. He never took the throne, dying before his father, but his bloodline lived on, and that's where the true consequences unfolded. His children and grandchildren inherited the genetic burden of a family obsessed with blood purity. One of his descendants, Louis XVI, the king, who would lose his head to the guillotine. Louis the Grand Dauphin was the calm before the storm. He looked like the future of France, but his very existence was a quiet warning. Inbreeding doesn't always scream it, whispers, waits, and then collapses dynasties. His legacy wasn't just wealth and titles, it was the silent transmission of a genetic time bomb, one that would detonate over generations. In the shimmering halls of Versailles, Louis was the prince who had everything except 8 great-grandparents. And that missing genetic diversity would echo through the Bourbon line like a curse in royal silk. If Charles II was the ghost of Spain's downfall, then Don Carlos was the scream that came before it. Born in 1545 as the only son of King Philip II of Spain, Don Carlos was supposed to be the future of a vast and powerful empire. But from the moment he entered the world, something was wrong. His head was too large, his spine curved, his temperament unstable, and lurking beneath it all was a devastating truth. Don Carlos had only 4 unique great-grandparents. His family tree wasn't branching, it was folding in on itself. By his teenage years, the signs of degeneration were impossible to ignore. He suffered wild mood swings, frequent hallucinations, and bouts of violent rage. One story claims he chased palace maids with knives. Another says he tried to defenestrate a servant for waking him too early. His father, an iron-fisted king, began to fear him not just as a son, but as a potential threat to the throne. And then, after a fall down the stairs, left him with a traumatic brain injury. Everything unraveled. He stopped eating, spoke in riddles, wasted away in his chambers like a cursed prince in a Gothic tale. Eventually, Philip II made a grim decision. His own son was too dangerous to rule. Don Carlos was imprisoned in isolation, and there he died at age 23, starved of power, purpose, and perhaps even food. He wasn't assassinated by enemies, but slowly erased by the father who gave him life and the bloodline that cursed him. Don Carlos wasn't a ruler. He was a relic, a living warning of what happens when royal pride overrides biology and ambition blinds itself to degeneration. His story isn't just tragic, it's genetic prophecy. And the tragedy is, Spain saw it coming, but couldn't look away. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, and once you see his face, you understand why. Charles II of Spain wasn't just the last Habsburg king of a crumbling empire. He was the physical embodiment of a bloodline too proud to stop breeding with itself. His family had intermarried for over 200 years, cousin after cousin, uncle after niece, and Charles was the final product, a genetic dead end wrapped in royal robes. He didn't speak until the age of 4, didn't walk until 8. His jaw was so oversized he could barely chew, and his tongue so swollen he choked on words. He was sterile, riddled with seizures, and constantly ill, his body failing as if it had been born old. But the real horror wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Charles was the moment royal inbreeding stopped being a private flaw and became a public curse. The king of a Catholic superpower once feared across Europe was now a frail, confused man-child who couldn't govern, couldn't father an heir, and barely understood the throne he sat on. The court whispered that he was cursed by witches, but the truth was far more terrifying. He was cursed by his ancestors. When he died at 35, doctors found his body grotesquely malformed, his heart blackened, his skull filled with fluid, and his brain underdeveloped. His autopsy read like the final chapter of a doomed experiment. With no children to succeed him, the Spanish Habsburg line died with Charles. The end wasn't a war, an assassination, or a revolution. It was him, a man so broken by the very blood that made him royal. Charles II wasn't just a king. He was a warning, a living monument to what happens when power protects itself at the cost of evolution. His throne was made of gold, but his body was made of centuries of genetic collapse. She was the sister of a king so deformed they called him bewitched, yet somehow Margarita Teresa of Spain was born into the same twisted bloodline and emerged functional, beautiful even, intelligent, charming. She was the exception that proved the rule, a glittering mask worn by a dynasty collapsing from the inside. But make no mistake, her story is not a fairy tale. It's a tragedy in disguise. Margarita was the daughter of uncle-niece marriage, just like her brother Charles II. Her Habsburg genes were tangled beyond repair. Her jaw pronounced her features unmistakably inbred. And yet she walked, talked, and ruled with poise. While Charles stumbled through life like a sick child in a crown, Margarita was groomed to be the shining jewel of the empire. Her portrait by Velázquez, still studied today, depicts her as a porcelain doll of royal perfection. But what the canvas doesn't show is the cost of that perfection. At the age of 15, she was married off to her own maternal uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, another Habsburg, another loop in the family chain. Her body bore the burden of that choice. She gave birth 6 times before the age of 21. Miscarriages, stillbirths, illness, pain. By the time she died of bronchitis at just 21 years old, her once celebrated beauty had faded into exhaustion. Her spine had curved, her heart had failed. She didn't break the curse, she just delayed it. Margarita Teresa wasn't salvation. She was a flicker of false hope, a living symbol that the dynasty's blood could still produce something beautiful, if only for a moment. But beauty doesn't outlast biology, and even diamonds crack under pressure when they're mined from the same broken vein. He ruled as a god, but he walked with a cane. Tutankhamun, better known as King Tut, was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt at just 9 years old. But behind the golden mask and the opulent tomb lay a fragile, crumbling body forged not by divinity, but by incest. His parents weren't just cousins, they were full siblings. And that single decision, rooted in ancient beliefs about royal purity, created a child born to break beneath the weight of his bloodline. Tutankhamun's short life was defined by suffering. CT scans of his mummified corpse revealed a twisted spine, a clubbed foot, and bones so brittle he likely needed assistance to walk. He had malaria, genetic disorders, a cleft palate. The boy king may have worn the crown of Horus, but inside he was unraveling. His left leg was shattered just before death, possibly from a fall, though it's debated whether that fall was an accident or an attempt to escape the prison of his own body. But it wasn't just his body that was broken. It was the entire royal lineage. The Egyptian elite believed that to maintain divine blood, they must keep it pure, marrying sister to brother for generation after generation. In doing so, they didn't create gods, they created ghosts. Tutankhamun's glory came not from what he accomplished in life, but from what his remains reveal in death, a dynasty so obsessed with immortality, they bred themselves into extinction. His lavish tomb, packed with gold jewels and sacred relics, was a monument to greatness. But his skeleton tells a different story of genetic collapse disguised as divine right. Tut didn't die in battle. He didn't fall to treachery. He died because his family folded in on itself. He was a king, yes, but also a warning wrapped in linen and buried beneath centuries of denial. She was born into a bloodline so entangled it defied logic. Maria Antonia of Austria wasn't just a Habsburg, she was the Habsburg, the most inbred member of Europe's most notoriously incestuous dynasty, her parents' uncle and niece, and her grandparents, also uncle and niece. She wasn't the product of one broken link, she was the result of generations of looping DNA stitched together by fear of losing power. And yet somehow she defied every expectation. Unlike her cousin Charles II, who was physically disfigured and mentally unfit, Maria Antonia appeared healthy, charming, and even beautiful by 17th century standards. She was intelligent, musically gifted, and carried herself with the poise of a future empress. But even beauty couldn't mask the shadow in her veins. Her life was short, tragic, predictable, married at 15, pregnant almost immediately. She gave birth 3 times, only one child survived infancy. By 23, she was dead, her body broken by complications from childbirth. The empire had wrung every drop of fertility from her, and then it let her die. But the most disturbing part, before her death, she was almost married to her own uncle Charles II of Spain, the same man who could barely chew, speak, or think clearly. That match was canceled only at the last moment. Had it happened, it would have been one of the most genetically catastrophic unions in royal history. Maria Antonia was spared that fate, but not by mercy, only by timing. She didn't end the Habsburg bloodline, but she was one of its last desperate offerings, a final attempt to keep the illusion of strength alive. She was the rose growing from poisoned roots, beautiful but doomed to wilt. And in the end, even her perfection couldn't escape the consequences of a family that confused power with purity. She ruled an empire, seduced emperors, and spoke more languages than most modern diplomats. To the world, Cleopatra was brilliance incarnate, a queen of strategy, intellect, and unmatched charisma. But behind the legend of Egypt's most famous ruler lies a disturbing secret. Cleopatra may have been the most inbred person in recorded history. Her family, the Ptolemies, believed they were divine. And to preserve that supposed divinity, they didn't just marry cousins, they married siblings. Repeatedly, generation after generation, Cleopatra's father married his own sister. So did his father before him. The royal family tree wasn't a tree at all, it was a circle drawn in blood. And yet, unlike many victims of inbreeding, Cleopatra didn't suffer from obvious deformities or illness. That's where the mystery deepens. Some scholars believe her mother may not have been her father's sister, but a concubine of different blood. If true, it would explain her sharp intellect, physical health, and striking beauty. But if not, then Cleopatra was a miracle born from genetic ruin, a final spark in a lineage that should have already collapsed. The real twist, her dynasty didn't end with an assassination or a rebellion. It ended with her. After her death by snakebite or poison, depending on the version, the Ptolemaic dynasty vanished. No heirs, no future, just a tomb and a myth. Cleopatra wasn't just the last pharaoh of Egypt. She was the last breath of a bloodline that had coiled around itself like the asp said to have ended her life. She outsmarted Rome. She outshone kings. But in the end, she couldn't outrun the legacy in her veins. Cleopatra was a queen born of gods and ghosts, a woman whose brilliance flickered from the darkest corner of human inheritance. A dynasty preserved by incest. A legend sealed by tragedy. We like to think of royalty as untouchable, cloaked in velvet, crowned in gold, chosen by fate. But peel back the portraits, the palaces, the polished marble, and what do you find? Not strength, not superiority, but fear. Fear of losing power. Fear of bloodlines thinning. Fear that the divine right to rule could be diluted by something as human as love. That fear birthed a legacy of inbreeding, a desperate gamble to keep power pure, even if it meant marrying your niece, your cousin, or your own sister. And the price? It wasn't just deformity or madness. It was empires collapsing from within. From the fragile bones of King Tut to the haunting silence of Charles II's sterile throne, these stories weren't isolated tragedies. They were warnings carved into royal history, reminders that nature doesn't bend for kings, and bloodlines can't be forced into perfection without consequences. Even Cleopatra, radiant and brilliant, stood atop a family tree so twisted it finally broke beneath her. These weren't monsters. They were victims born into dynasties that valued power over health, legacy over life. And while we may not live in castles, the message still matters. Any system, be it family, company, or nation, that feeds on itself and fears change will eventually destroy its future. Obsession with purity in any form, racial, cultural, genetic, isn't tradition. It's self-destruction wearing a crown. So what can we take away? That strength comes not from locking the gates, but opening them. That real legacy is built through diversity, connection, and courage, not control. And that sometimes the most important thing we can do is break the cycle. Because when power marries fear, the children always pay the price. If this story shocked you, made you rethink history, or just left you speechless, don't keep it to yourself. Drop a comment below with the moment that hit you hardest, or share your own theory about royal bloodlines. Hit that save button so you can come back to this twisted tale anytime. And if you want more dark, true stories from history's forgotten corners, don't forget to subscribe. One click keeps you connected to the past, and trust me, we've only just scratched the surface.